Beginning today, we start our journey through this week that is at the heart of our Christian faith. We call this week Holy, and the question I would like to pose to you today is, what makes it so? What makes this week holy? We often talk about holy places. I like to think of holy places as those thin spaces between heaven and earth that diminishes as we approach holiness and contemplation of holiness. Holy spaces can often be in churches or particular parts of churches. We think of this table as a holy spot when we approach it for the Eucharist. Some people might think of a yoga mat as a holy place because it's set apart for improvement of mind and body and spirit. A holy spot can be found in a walk in the woods with the wind rustling through the trees, or it can also be found on a beach, hearing the waves gently caressing the sand, because we hear the voice of God in those places. A certain chair in a home might be holy for some people because it's set apart for spiritual contemplation. There are also public places that convey a sense of holiness to many of us. For me, the Lincoln Memorial is one of those spaces. Hearing the gracious, wise, and healing words of Abraham Lincoln, expressing the sorrow of so many Americans over the losses that were sustained during that awful time. I made a recent visit to the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, where Martin Luther King lost his life, and where so many Americans believed they had lost their hopes for his vision. This place filled me with a sense of holiness. We talk also about holy times. This week, for instance, in my experience, that sense of holiness only comes as I pay close attention to it, which includes preparing for it. I grew up in a religious tradition that made a very big deal about Easter, but in a different way than we do. My mama would buy us all new Sunday clothes and shoes, and we would travel down to East Texas to visit my grandmother, go to her Methodist church where my Uncle Ed sang in a choir that swelled to a total of 5 people on Easter Sunday, where they sang, "Up from the grave he arose," with a mighty triumph for his foes. Not a hymn that appears in our hymnal, but one that many of you may have heard. Communion was never a part of the celebration, and we didn't do a whole lot to observe the days leading up to Easter. I had never heard of Maundy Thursday until I became an Episcopalian. And before then, I thought Good Friday was called good because school was out that day. My migration to the Episcopal Church taught me that the Easter experience, the power of the message of the resurrection, is deepened by observance during the week before, the week that precedes. I get glimmers of why that week is set apart and why it's holy for us. During this coming week, it means that on some level, varying from year to year, I try to attend to the reason for the season, attend to the message of the various liturgies that we observe and that unfold during this rich week in ways sometimes great and sometimes small. There's today, Palm Sunday, with the spiritual whiplash that begins with the Grand Jerusalem Parade, echoing with hosannas, that turns quickly into Jesus' arrest and trial, torture and execution, a reminder that public opinion and the fate of those bound to it can shift rather quickly. There are the first 3 days of the week, each with their thematic contribution to the story. You can check out those stories each day in the coming week if you wish by going to the website lectionarypage.net, and I intend to send them to all of you via email if you would like to read them. Then there's Maundy Thursday, which takes its name from the commandment or the mandate, in Greek the mandatum. That's why we call it Maundy Thursday, to show love, to be of service, reflected in the institution of the Eucharist and the washing of the disciples' feet. What does that holy night teach us about putting faith to work in the world? And then there's Good Friday, which always poses for me the question of why we call this Friday good, which I will try to address with you if you're able to return here this coming Friday at noon. Then there's Holy Saturday, a day to note that grief often calls simply for silence and for waiting. All of it can be holy. All of it can be set apart for us. And all of it offers a window into the holy mystery of God's love at work in this world. God's love overcoming the worst that the world could dish out. All of it points to the mystery that in the face of human denial, betrayal, violence and abuse, cowardice and callousness, in the face of all that, love ultimately wins. That's what we celebrate in Holy Week. So how might you and I prepare for this week? I can't say what that will be for you, and I'm not even sure this year what it will be for me. I never know it fully until I try to go through it. Maybe I can use this last week of Lent to ask God to help me experience each day of this Holy Week as holy. Remember how Jesus told the disciples to inform the borrowed colt's owner that the animal was being taken because the Lord had need of it. Perhaps the need Jesus felt was to use a symbol that spoke not of might and majesty, but of humility and service. While the crowd cheered his entry into the city, the visual image Jesus projected was that of a humble servant. Throughout his ministry, and especially during this moment of tempting power, Jesus rejected power and chose the cross instead. Often on Sunday morning, when I'm in the shower, I think of the service that's coming, and this Sunday was no different. And I thought that one thing that I wanted to say is that we can use this week to move from the fear and anxiety about those things that we see only temporarily, and to find a way to move to a peace and a knowledge of that which is eternal. Let us this week not worry about the Mueller report, the subpoenas, the arguments, the rankling, the anger, the announcing of new candidates. Let us this week try to find a way to move to the peace and knowledge of that which is eternal. The ultimate message, I think, simply stated is this: by his wounds you have been healed, and I have been healed. Christ died for us that he might bring us to God. He took for himself a body like our own. Because we are all liable to the corruption of our bodies and spirits, he surrendered his to death instead of us. The word passion that we hear in today's gospel, the passion of Christ, comes from the Greek word pati, P-A-T-I, which means to suffer. So having compassion means to suffer with. This week, let us try to understand the suffering with us that Jesus did for us. Humanity is in bondage to sin, and we are in need of deliverance from that sin. Christ came to suffer with us and to provide for us that way of deliverance. There was a guy named Lancelot Andrewes who was an English bishop and scholar and held high positions in the Church of England during the early part of the 17th century in the reigns of Elizabeth and King James. He wrote the following, which is much better than any summary that I could give you today. He says this: Jesus' passion was the only sufficient price of the dear purchase of redemption for all of our souls. Let us this week live into an understanding of the significance of the love that motivated Christ to suffer that torturous death for each of us. Let us take a few moments